of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. We meet every week of the academic year at this time in this room. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'm just going to give you a preview. We have only one more speaker this quarter. Next week, Tom Kraft is coming from the University of Utah, and his talk is entitled Modeling the Dynamics of Infectious Disease Transmission in a Small-Scale Subsistence Population. And after that, we take a break for spring break and then have a full lunch of spring quarter speakers, which you can find on our website at bec.ucla.edu. This week, I'm happy to introduce Sean Prall, who's coming from the University of Missouri, and his talk is entitled Perceptions That Matter, Using Peer Evaluations and Dyadic Data to Explore Behavior in Prall, Namibia.
All right, thank you guys so much for having me. So today I'm going to kind of talk about the methods behind dyadic data collection and analysis, and then talk about two case studies where we are using this data to answer sort of interesting questions about behavior in rural Namibia. So, as anthropologists, we're often trying to, capture real-world measures, actually discrete things that can be quantified and counted, things like anthropometrics, biomarkers, wealth data, material culture, demographics, all that good stuff, right? But we're also interested in measuring lots of social dynamics and behavior for which easily objective measures and methods are a little bit more difficult. So think about things like cooperativeness, social networks, social interactions, social norms, individual personality attributes, all that good stuff. And so when we're interested in people's perceptions of others, there are significant methodological hurdles. And some of these sort of less overt domains where you can't go out and say just like count cows, for example, you need to leverage some sort of community knowledge, community measure to get at those data. And so for those really slippery measures where we can't just rely on things like Likert scales, we need to sort of think about it more sophisticated, nuanced ways to get at some of these perceptions. And we know one potential problem here is that a lot of the sort of perception data, if you're using Likert scales, for example, you're not actually measuring decision making, you're measuring preferences. And so to illustrate the importance of separating reported preferences from actual decisions, we've got two dueling PNAS papers up here. So the first one is Buston and Imlin. They were looking at how self-assessed mate value, basically like how desirable I am on a Likert scale, impacts mating preferences. And they basically found that like self-rated perception and mate value correlates with mate preference, basically like attracts like, and you want to sort of pair up with partners of similar desirability. And again, this is just using the Likert scales of how desirable am I and what kind of partner do I want. Todd et al., and the second piece of this, they reran this using a speed dating task, and so they gave participants a barrage of the same sort of Likert scale surveys, and they largely replicate the Buston and Imlin results, but then they run these participants through a speed dating event and actually see what they do. And it turns out that, quote, stated preferences did not predict actual choices. And so what people say they want in a partner is not what they actually end up doing when it comes into an actual sort of partnership sorting experiment. So there's many other examples of this out there where reported preferences don't match actual behavior. Elizabeth Pillsworth, for example, has kind of a nice study showing that men and women don't actually like what they say they like. There's a bunch of other papers out there as well that show similar findings here. So we should be, I'm trying to move this out of the way here. So we should be really wary of research that relies only on what people say they want. And second issue here with using reported behaviors is that they may just be restating social norms. So two studies up here, the Du and May study here. This is a study of parental investment in Tibetan pastoralists. They find really, really strong son preferences across time in these Tibetan pastoralists. But when they looked at actual behavior, they found strong preference for daughters in terms of things like breastfeeding duration and offspring survival. Lee Cronk in the 90s performed very similar work in East Africa. Similarly, in our paper, we looked at norms for paternal investment. Basically, people are saying that, yes, you have to be fair to all your offspring, whether they're yours or not, when in fact, the actual data suggests that men aren't always doing that when they can get away with it. So again, we should be really careful of just using stated behaviors because people are preferentially just reporting social norms. Okay. So because of these and other issues with relying on self-assessments of behavior, I'm going to really emphasize the utility of peer ratings or peer evaluations to collect data. So basically asking people to rate their peers on various traits and then use this data to get a better understanding of social dynamics. There's lots of advantages to this approach, of course. It allows you to leverage community knowledge, right? So you're basically asking people their perceptions of others where they may have, a decades-long relationship with those people. You can ask them to emphasize particular cultural traits, which is something that we try and do. Ask them what's important in this particular domain, and then rate people in that domain, right? So we're not sort of bringing in outside perceptions here. And this allows people to use, culturally relevant assessments. And peer evaluation is also good even when you have no real-world corollary. So for many traits, you can't map perceptions onto actual outcomes. So it doesn't really matter, for example, if someone is actually the smartest or most generous person in the community. If people believe you're the smartest and most generous person in the community, that might be what's more important. So again, perception can be more important than reality sometimes. But there are domains where perception actually maps onto real-world outcomes. And we know that peer evaluations can reliably map onto local knowledge. And so there's a couple of studies I've highlighted here, basically assessing assessing ecological or ethnobotanical knowledge. And they basically are showing that when people say someone is knowledgeable or skilled in a particular domain, those evaluations actually correlate with real-world knowledge as these authors have assessed it. So here's two studies up here, one from Victoria Reyes-Garcia matching perceived peer-evaluated knowledge about ethnobotanical knowledge. Jeremy Koster has a paper looking at fishing. Again, you can see that in some cases it doesn't quite work out, but in some cases the peer-evaluated data match onto actual real-world outcomes. Of course, it's not always possible to correlate evaluations with actual outcomes. Think about like desirability, for example. What do you match desirability or mate value onto? There might be some proxies for this, but you can't necessarily directly measure it. Okay, so a couple of methodological considerations when using peer evaluations. It's useful in areas when you want to know more about the individual perceptions of people in the community rather than some feature of people's knowledge or performance, right? So again, for many areas, there might not be an objective real-world outcome. So you also need to use a domain that's sort of accessible to the community. You must be using some features that peers can assess. You can't sort of ask them things that they don't know anything about. Just for an example, we've been interested in measuring basically how good fathers are in Himba communities. And so we sort of tested this a little bit to see, like, can you rate individual men in the community on sort of are they good fathers or not? And people basically say, oh, I have no idea. So this is sort of an example of an attribute where we might want to measure it, but because it's not accessible to the community, this is not something that's fair game for peer evaluations. And then if you really care about individual versus community level measures, if you really only care about community level data, there's no need to do this. There's other ways to do this, social vignette studies, counterfactuals and things. You can get sort of norms of the community that it's a little easier than this method. Methodologically, there's a couple of ways to do this. So Cody Ross and Dan Redhead have a package here where they have sort of done all the legwork for you and automated this process. So it's very quick to get these sort of peer evaluations. Basically, they recommend you collect photographs of everybody in the community. You come pre-prepared with these sort of photo cards, and you have people basically rate individuals in the community. You can have red or green tokens, for example, that gives them a high or low quantity on some trait. They have another paper where they are rating attractiveness, and they use the same photo board, and they give you like 4 or 5 tokens out of the total number, and you rate which people are most attractive. And then you can just take a photo of this on your phone, upload it into the software, and Cody Ross does some magic here, and it spits it out into R. So this is a very cool way to do it. I'll show you a different way we're going to do it here. I wouldn't advocate using a ranking task. If you are, say, ranking individuals in your community on some trait, it makes the analysis really, really complicated. Another option is to use free lists to say, okay, who is most influential or most generous in your community? That could be useful, but it's only going to give you data on a very small number of people in your community. So what we do is we collect peer evaluation data using a tablet task. And so this allows us to sort of leverage our database. We are just basically pulling photos from our database. We can spit it out into this sort of format, and then we have people rate individuals with binary outcomes. So for every participant, they're shown a series of photos, randomized photos, and we ask them to rate these people on some trait. The traits come from a focus group on what's important in choosing a partner. So again, we're using sort of like community-driven traits, not sort of outsider traits coming in. And there's lots of benefits of doing it this way. This allows us to add individuals as we go. So as we're in the field and we meet somebody that we've not met before, we don't have their photograph, we can add it directly into the database, and then we can immediately start collecting data on that person. People also really like doing these tasks, unlike some very burdensome like social networking tasks. People actually enjoy, they have fun doing this. They will come to camp, be like, hey, want to rate some more photos? Bring me the tablet, and they'll sit down and do it. And so it's always nice when participants actually like to do the task, right? It's also quite automated. You can just sit them down with the translator, and then you can just crank through a bunch of data collection. So it's very convenient. So again, we did 6 different traits here, just binary yes or no, where they were shown a photo. And people did about 20 individual evaluations per trait. So we collected quite a bit of data, and if they wanted to do it again, we let them do it again. So that's one task. The second task we used was the mating preference task. So we asked people, how much do you want to be in a relationship with this person? And we asked for a Likert scale response. You can see they saw a real world photo, not a watercolor photo, a real photo. And they asked, on a Likert scale from none to high, how much you want to be in a relationship with that person. We also collected data on whether they've ever had sex or had a kid with that person. So this is also something they quite like to do, and it's also, it's very automated. So the 2 case studies today I'm going to be showing you are going to be using these 2 peer evaluation tasks. And let me just show you, this generates lots and lots of data, and this is probably the least useful plot I've ever made and presented on, but I thought it was kind of fun. So this is yes or no rating. Each line down here is an individual, and each dot is an individual evaluation. So it's not easy to glean too much from this. So what do you do when you have 10,000 individual evaluations, right? You have to sort of figure out how are you going to actually analyze all this data. What a lot of people who are into the dyadic data collection analysis will argue is for a multi-level approach, which is one I also like. So I think it's often tempting to calculate an average score, and you can probably do this if you have enough evaluations. You get a percentage of basically who is rated influential. And there is evidence that if you do it this way, the more people you get to do these evaluations, the more accurate your evaluations are. However, in doing so, you sort of lose the multi-level structure of the data. So you've got raters and you've got ratees, right? And individual traits between each of those matter for the outcome. And so a multi-level approach allows you to leverage the multi-level nature of the data, basically. The interaction between rater and ratee can be a variable unto itself or a question unto itself. And so if you just get an average, you lose all the individual level effects. I will note that at least in the sort of trials I've done, average ratings and model ratings, they're strongly positively correlated, so we're not losing anything by doing this, but I think we are gaining something by doing this. Yeah. Another way to do it is to use a networks-based approach to treat individuals as nodes in the network, and then you calculate some sort of like eigenvector centrality variable or something like that to measure where they fall in the network. Or you can do what's shown here. This is actually the Google PageRank algorithm. This is how Google decides what's going to come on the top of your search. And this does something quite different. So if you use this to measure like desirability, for example, it would actually give people who are more desirable more weight. So if you're a highly desirable person and you rate other people as desirable, your evaluations give more weight in the algorithm. So this is sort of an interesting networks-based approach. And in fact, this study used exactly that. They used a PageRank algorithm using an online dating market, and they were able to sort of find some interesting attributes of the network here, showing how mate value changes the way that men and women basically message people on a dating app, for example. So this is just sort of one application of this. This isn't really something we can use in our data for various reasons, but I think it's an interesting approach to consider. Okay, so I'm going to focus today on two case studies, women's status I'll start with, and I'll turn into mating markets, which is sort of builds off the slide I just showed you. So all this stuff was done as part of the Rural Kunene Rural Health and Demography Project. This is a long-term project looking at demography, health, reproduction in Himba pastoralists of northern Namibia. You guys have all heard about this before. And most of you know about the Himba, so I won't spend too much time on this. Semi-nomadic pastoralists. They practice double descent, which I'll come back to in the status section a little bit. Polygynous, lots of female autonomy and partner choice. Women have a lot of say in who they're choosing. Yeah. So for the methods for these two projects, I'm just gonna go over real briefly here. I'm leveraging both of these tasks I showed you before, the ratings task and the mate preference task. And I'm combining that with some of the demographic data we've collected, as well as longitudinal anthropometrics in kids and adults. We have some interesting relationship history and marital data, which I'll show you. And then, of course, individual and household level surveys. We've got like lots of different structured data, right? You've got individual evaluations, you've got household data, and you've got individual level, data that's non-movable. Okay, so let's start with women's status. So status has benefits for reproductive success in males and females of basically all social living mammals. Lots of evidence in primates, for example, that both males and females receive reproductive success or fitness benefits from being high status, right? In humans, it's focused mostly on men. We see in small scale populations, men's status is often associated with things like higher fertility, lower offspring mortality. Women in small scale societies are much less likely to hold formal political positions, even in societies that tend to be relatively gender egalitarian. Although I would say that the ethnographic record on women's political roles and status is pretty spotty, so we can't necessarily trust that all that much. We see strong sex differences in status in most small-scale societies. A couple of reasons why this might be the case. It could be that men really have high fitness benefits to strive to accrue status, and so they should be more motivated to seek status. It could be that there's, the gender division of labor makes status acquisition for women a little bit more difficult, whereas it affords men, more social networking opportunities. It may result in men having, higher status resources that they can turn into social status. It may limit women's reproductive opportunity, women's economic opportunities, et cetera. And then there's lots of opportunity costs for women that might limit their ability to accrue status. The burden of childcare typically falls on women. This might explain why it's typically post-reproductive women who don't have the burdens of childcare are those that are more likely to be high status, that are more likely to be in formal political positions. And there's other stuff as well, a descent type, that sort of thing. Less is known about how status impacts fitness in women, but we have a couple of predictions here. We know that, for example, in the Mosu, in matrilineal groups, they have larger social networks and a more diverse social network compared to patrilineal populations, linking high status in women with matrilineal, and I'll return to that in a second. Women tend to have higher household level decision making when they have more status. In the Tsimane, we know that women's status is related to household decision making. And it looks like there's probably some outcomes with beneficial outcomes with child health for women's status. So in the Tsimane, this is a paper by Sarah Lamy, maternal but not paternal status and political influence was positively associated with child's anthropometrics and lower morbidity to common illness. So it seems like, at least in the Tsimane, where women accrue high status, it benefits their children's health. And so Himba are a good case study for this because they are double descent population. And so that means that they inherit their wealth from the matriline. Matrilineal biased populations tend to be those where women have more say in household level decision making, lower intimate partner violence, that sort of thing. And so it seems like matrilineal tends to be associated with more female status and autonomy. Nobody's looked at status in a population like this, and so it's a good case study to see whether these descent type differences actually might mediate status differences. So we wanted to look at three things. We wanted to look at what are the determinants of women's status, what actually is driving women's status in this population. Are there sex differences in status? Is this like an East African pastoralist population where men take all the status and women are lower in status? Or is it more egalitarian as the descent type might suggest? And then if so, what are the fitness relevant outcomes for women? Why would women accrue status? What do they gain from it? And again, all this stuff is drawing from all this model trait data that I talked about earlier. So let's start with the determinants of women's status. This is showing individual predictors from that trait data on what predicts women's status. You can see here that things generous, respectful, and smart are the top 3 traits for driving or being associated with women's status. Age is as well, and I should note that, age is right here. Age is included in all these models, and it's also a model by itself because age is associated with some of these traits, and I'll talk about some of the covariance issues here a little bit later on. We added fertility in here because women wear a lot of bracelets and jewelry that signal fertility. They wear these anklets, and they've got 2 bands on the anklets. That means they've had at least 2 kids. So it seems to be that there's like a lot of signaling going on with having lots of children. So we thought that might be a driver here, not particularly strong. Wealth, no association with status in women. So richer women don't seem to have more status. Okay. So we, of course, this is interesting. We want to compare it to men as well. So on the left, you are looking at all these modeled traits. Each y-axis here is a probability, so the probability of age and, the probability of being influential, and then across different age ranges here. So what we're seeing is that in general, they're pretty similar, right? We're not seeing a lot of major differences in what drives status between men and women. Over here, I'm comparing these varying slopes. So wealth, for example, stronger driver of status in men than women. Fertility, a stronger driver of status. But for the most part, these are all sort of overlapping, suggesting that there's not major differences in the type of things, at least that we've measured here, that are separating men's and women's status. And I note I'm not making kind of strong claims about causality here for things like wealth and fertility. I'm just simply interested in trying to figure out what is associated with status in men and women. Okay, so the second piece here is, are there status differences in men and women in this population? And it turns out that we actually cannot find this, which is really interesting. So I've modeled here what's the probability of being rated influential by men and women. You can see here that we can actually find that men and women rate people differently. Women are a little bit more discerning in their evaluation of status. Men are a little bit more giving in their evaluations of status, but there's not actually sex-by-sex interactions there. So when you model this all together, we see no sex differences in the status in this population. Men and women are not evaluated differently, at least according to our task. And remember that this is associated with things like household level decision-making, intimate partner violence, gender gaps in education, et cetera. So this stuff really might matter. I will note that men are still much more likely in this population to hold formal political positions. All the chiefs and sub-chiefs are men. This doesn't necessarily relate to a political office, but it does seem like status tends to be pretty egalitarian in this society. Okay. I also wanted to see if status had an impact in those partner preference ratings I showed you earlier. So basically, are women who are of higher status more desirable? So we modeled some of this desirability data. And you can see here there's sort of a generic age curve here where desirability peaks in the late 20s, early 30s here. So correcting for age, we actually find that higher status women are viewed as more desirable in their community, which is a little bit surprising. But I think this one explanation might be that because there's matrolateral inheritance of livestock, men's sons are inheriting livestock from their wives' brothers. It might make sense that women from a high status, high wealth matriline would be viewed more favorably. So you might want to marry a woman from a rich matriline because of your sons are going to inherit that wealth. So that might be one potential explanation. Okay. We also were looking to see if there's a relationship between the status of husbands and wives. We actually do see a weak correlation here, stronger for marital than non-marital couples. This may be sort of a feature of assortative mating, like pairs with like, so you might just sort of marry somebody who's of relatively similar status to you. It may also be that men and women are building their status with the reputation of their partners. But this correlation is similar to what we see in other populations as well. The Chimane correlation is also very similar. Okay. So we wanted to look at some of these fitness relevant outcomes in this population to see how status is impacting, in particular, child health. And what we see is that high status women tend to have children with better anthropometrics. So, and it looks like it's, there's a kind of interaction effect with age here. So women with high status tend to have kids with, that are a little bit taller, particularly when those kids are younger. So again, this suggests that there's some sort of positive effect of women's status on household dynamics in some way. I will note that this is very similar to what Sarah Alami found in the Chimane population as well. So we looked at not just height, but we looked at a bunch of different traits here. Here I'm showing you all the model predictions of maternal and paternal status effects independently for height, weight, and BMI. And you can see here, for example, this is mom's status on height. We don't see much of an effect for weight or BMI here. No, interestingly, dad's status does matter in this population, unlike the Chimane, where dad's status didn't have an effect. Dad's status does matter here. We've also included, mom's height, weight, and BMI as a kind of a control variable. Interestingly, and not surprisingly, this doesn't matter for dads because the non-paternity rate is so high that we actually are not capturing dads in all these circumstances. But these interactions between mom and dad's status is probably related to things like wealth. Also because mom's and dad's status is already correlated, right? So we've got a lot of sort of confounding effects going on here, which make it sort of difficult to tease apart whose status matters more. So one way we wanted to look at this was to, since mom and dad's status both seem to matter for child anthropometrics, and both are correlated, and both are related to things like household wealth, we wanted to compare the relative effects of mom and dad's status. So we calculated standardized residuals per dyad. So basically, if mom and dad's status is correlated, if it's above the line, if it's a positive measure here, then mom's status is higher than what predicted for dad's status, and vice versa, right? So we can sort of tease apart now relative individual dyadic status level effects. And what we find is that, in fact, this does seem to matter again. So when women's status is higher, kids tend to be taller. They tend to have higher weight. BMI is sort of on the verge here, but it's not quite there. So it does look like when mom's status is higher, then would be predicted for dad's status, kids do better, right? So this again points to the idea that women are leveraging their status to the benefit of their children. Okay. Okay, so in determining and looking at determinants of status, we found basically that men's and women's status, determinants of status, these traits that predict status are pretty similar. So we don't really see strong sex differences in what predicts status. We also don't find much of a sex difference in status, right? So that's pretty interesting, and I think really speaks to the role of matrilineality in the society. So we also found, again, that women with more status, and particularly women with more status than their husbands, tend to benefit their children. Okay, so that's case study 1. So case study 2, we're going to turn to the desirability data I talked about, where we had everybody rate each other on how desirable a partner they are. And then we're looking basically at trying to understand the mating market dynamics in the society. And so we're approaching this from the context of biological market theory. This is basically an application of economic market principles to biological systems. So instead of thinking about the interaction between individuals or species as a biological interaction, think about it as an economic one. So it's kind of like, we're looking at supply and demand changes between men and women, or between agents in this case, on how they interact with the outcome. So we have distinct trading classes under this theory. This could be flowers and pollinators. This could be 2 different microbes interacting. This could be a cleaner fish, and it's the bigger fish it cleans, I don't know what that's called, or any other dynamic where there's sort of 2 individuals interacting in sort of a marketplace environment. But of course, we're thinking about males and females for this sake. And under this idea, we need to consider the exchange of goods and services for mutual benefit. So this is not an interaction like parasitism. This is like, in the flower and pollinator example, both flower and bee are profiting from this dynamic interaction. Males and females, of course, there's a profit as well, resulting in fitness benefits. And notably, trading classes can be asymmetrical. So one class it's always easier to find a new trading partner. And the other class will compete amongst themselves to have the highest market value to compete for that second class. So market value can be one-sided in this case. So we're applying this idea to mating markets. We're considering males and females as the two trading classes. The exchange good could be gametes, it could be parental care, it could be nuptial gifts, anything like that. And the asymmetry between males and females is defined by a couple parameters, notably the sex ratio in the population. So the rarer sex tends to be the one that has higher market value because it has more options to choose from and less competitors. Okay, so that's what kind of biological market theory is, and that's the sort of angle we're taking for this piece. And I'll just note that there's lots of interesting evidence for biological market theory playing a role in mating in a bunch of different species. The most famous one is the red bishop here. This is a colonial weaving bird in southern Africa. And in this bird, nests are built by males alone, and females will come. They'll nest in the male's nest. They'll incubate eggs. They do all the nesting by themselves without any paternal support. So the nests then become a commodity in this market, in this dynamic marketplace, and are chosen by females as the trading class. So females in this case don't choose males; they actually choose the nests. And because they need the nest to rear young, they prefer fresh nests, not old nests. And then during breeding periods, there's lots of pressure on males to build as many nests as possible, right? So there's this sort of interesting supply and demand, pull and push by the number of females in a male's territory, driving him to produce more nests, and then the quality of the nest can raise or decline depending on the number of nests and the number of competition in a territory. So this is a pretty cool paper looking at biological market theory in sort of a real-world context, and they found lots of basically exactly what you'd predict, that when there's an oversupply of females, females have to select for lower quality nests. When there are more females in a male's territory, male increases production and produces more nests to basically increase the supply to match the demand. So that's just sort of one example here that I think is cool. There's lots and lots of others that highlight that in mating dynamics in various species, we see this mating market approach working out. So that evidence that individuals are sensitive to changes in market value and they act accordingly, that they might move markets when their market value is lower, that they will adjust behavior to supply and demand, et cetera, et cetera. So we wanted to look at these same dynamics in our population and think about with this peer evaluation data. And I'll just say, I was sort of skeptical about this approach off the bat. This is a study we did a couple of years ago. We were looking at basically how resource demands change women's preferences. And just as sort of a random kind of side thing that ended up in the supplementary, we looked to see whether women who are more desirable are more choosy. This is sort of a basic prediction of biological market theory. And in fact, we don't see this at all. You can see these are all the ratings here across, and the x-axis here is female desirability coefficient. You see no difference in women who are more or less desirable being more or less discerning. So just as a function of this, I was kind of skeptical that this was going to work out at all. So we looked at this with both men and women with a larger data set and did some additional modeling. And let me just walk through what we found. So a basic principle of any marketplace is that there should be a hierarchy of desirability. Here we're looking at raw ratings here for men and women here. Average rating from 1 is low to 4 is high. You can see that men tend to receive lower ratings on average than do women, which is very common in any study that does this. So basically they have sort of a steeper hierarchy of desirability here to climb. And like I said, women are much more discerning in mating tasks. So there's lots of sort of funny anecdotes from women who were doing this task, sort of kind of mocking the men that they were rating as they did it. So we looked to see whether, again, with this larger data set, if desirability predicted anything about individual decisions. And we actually find that desirability and choosiness are linked for men, but not for women, which is really interesting, I think. So men but not women who are more desirable are also more selective. And you can see that here. So as this green line here goes up, basically the probability of a 1 rating and a low rating increases. And this is rater desirability on the x-axis. So basically, if you're a more desirable man, you're more likely to give any individual woman a low rating. Whereas women, it's nearly a flat line. This isn't really a meaningful slope here. So this is kind of odd. What we think is going on here is a collision of two things. We know that women are generally more discriminating than men in these market-based tasks, and you can see that here. Around 75% of the time, women are giving men a 1 rating, right? They're giving them the lowest rating across the board, right? So men are more likely to give women high ratings in general, but because this is a really skewed sex ratio population, there's a lot more women than men. This gives men more market power, and so this might make them more choosy and particularly more desirable men. Okay. So we're not just interested, of course, in desirability of the individual impacting decisions, but we wanted to see the relationship between rater and ratee. So like, what's the desirability gap between two people rating each other on their particular preferences? So to look at this question for all dyads where we collected preference data, we converted their mate value score into a categorical variable of about the same, the rater is more desirable or the ratee is more desirable. And then we use these different categories to look at preference. And so you can see this gives us sort of two, this is a categorical variable, so this gives us two dummy predictors, rater and ratee. And then I'm going to walk through this plot here, but we're basically testing between two competing hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is the market matching hypothesis. This is basically sort of a biological market theory approach that preferences will correspond with market principles. Basically, people should want to match up with people of similar desirability. You might find somebody who's objectively more desirable, but you shouldn't necessarily want to partner with that person. So it's sort of like looking for a sort of mating, looking to see whether people kind of pair with like individuals. And this should result in pretty stable relationships, there should be less competition if you are matching up with somebody who is about the same level of desirability as you. So for this prediction, these two distributions of these predictors are right here. They're below 0. Okay, so that's market matching. The second one is the aspirational matching hypothesis. And so this case, basically, we should expect that any rater to prefer ratees of higher desirability irrespective of anything else, right? So they won't prefer raters of lower desirability. They should be okay with same, but they really should be preferring people of higher desirability than themselves. And this could be true, but it comes at a cost. If you're trying to form a partnership with somebody of higher desirability than yourself, they may take more time to coax. The relationship might be less stable. And there's previous work to suggest that when there's mate value discrepancies between partners, there's more relationship dissatisfaction. So additionally, high mate value individuals might be tempting targets for others. So there's some reasons to sort of be suspicious that this is a good strategy. And so you can see here we've plotted what this is going to look like, ratee higher and rater over here. Okay, so what did we find? The last panel here is showing the model results here. So you can see it lines up very nicely with aspirational matching. Basically, people are reporting preference for individuals that are more desirable themselves across the board, right? This isn't particularly surprising, but we did want to sort of demonstrate this. And then I'll show you this last plot here. I've removed the categorical variable element here. So now we're seeing the difference in rater and ratee desirability on the x-axis, and then we see the probability of each individual rating. I make a lot of these cumulative ordered logit plots. I've never seen an effect this strong before. This is like the ideal version of these plots where the confidence intervals are very narrow. These make these nice big beautiful lines. I've never made one this clear before or since, but this really suggests that this is a very strong predictor of preference. Okay. So but again, we're just speaking about preferences here, right? This is just people saying who they would like to partner with. So we wanted to combine all this mate value data with actual relationship dynamics, real-world relationships. So we had a bunch of these relationship history surveys where we asked every individual in our study questions about their partners, the marital and non-marital partners, things like, how often do you see each other? Do you think that your boyfriend or girlfriend has got additional boyfriends and girlfriends? How long have you been together, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're going to look at the mate value discrepancies between people and see if they match onto some of these relationship dynamics. And so we do see some effects here. So we see that when your partner is of higher or lower value than you, they report talking to them on the phone less frequently. We don't see much of an effect for in-person contact. Additionally, we see that when you think that your partner is of higher value than you're more likely to say that they've got a bunch of extra boyfriends or girlfriends on the side, right? So this suggests something about how you view the dynamics of your relationship. Here we're looking at the correlations in mate value between individuals in our study. You can see male and female desirability here. Basically, we're seeing a correlation here, right? We're seeing sort of an assorted mating practices going on here, whereby people tend to partner up with individuals of similar desirability, right? And this is true for both marital and non-marital partners. This is a feature that we see in all sorts of domains in human mating studies that we've found in this case. And then the last piece here, we are looking at length of relationship, and we're actually finding that people who have more similar desirability tend to have longer relationships. So this is length of relationship at average age, and this is the absolute value of desirability difference. So as you diverge from your partner in desirability or vice versa, predicted length of relationship goes down. We also looked at sexual histories as well. So I told you when they did this mating preference task, we actually had them record if they've ever had sex with that person, and they did this for 10,000 people. We found that probability of previous sexual history declines as the relative desirability diverges between partners. So lots of evidence that mate value is really driving the formation of these partnerships, driving partnership instability in a way that's predicted by biological market theory. Okay. So just to sort of sum up here, I want to talk about some kind of new problems and future directions with this data. And if you sort of think back to the status piece where I had 6 different traits all being predicted, all looking at influence, this causes problems, right? Because we're generating data on a handful of different traits, and we think that these are culturally relevant traits, right? These are the traits that people say are important in choosing partners. And so we think that these traits are sort of fundamental to the community, and that they're sort of fundamentally different concepts, like generosity, respectfulness, hardworking. These are things that people say are important, right? However, as you could have guessed probably from the status plot I showed you, many of these trait scores are correlated and interrelated, right? So this causes lots of statistical problems trying to deal with this data. So back to the issue of status, if we want to understand what best predicts status, how do we deal with these issues of not having sort of strong priors about what hardworking does, what generosity does, what intelligence does, right? So for example, does being perceived as influential make you more likely to be perceived as generous, or is generosity driving people's perceptions of influence, right? What direction are the causal arrows going? So this is a real problem for this data. 3 potential solutions here. Number 1 is to have strong priors about a causal model, and then to basically do something like a structural equation model where you trace these relationships and you sort of have prior knowledge about what drives what. You could do some sort of data reduction procedure like a principal component analysis where you take all these traits and you reduce them into 1 or 2 fundamental things. I don't like that approach because I think that principal components are sort of impossible to understand anyway, so I don't want to do that. The number 3 here, this is something brand new that we're just now trying, is basically let the computer figure it out, do some machine learning magic, and try and figure out where the causal arrows are going. So this is brand new. I'm working on this stuff with my colleague Rob Walker at Mizzou. And so we were doing what's called Bayesian network structured learning, or BayesNets. This is a machine learning approach to creating a DAG, to creating a causal relationship here. So you are basically giving the computer a bunch of data and you're saying, okay, figure out the causality because I can't do it, right? And the computer will draw something like this. So it basically is evaluating causality and bootstrapping all these relationships and trying to come up with the most probable, what it thinks is the most probable DAG. Okay, so we did this with the trait value data, looking at men and women separately and together, so I'm going to show you these results now. Okay, so this is what BayesNet says is the most likely causal model for the trait values in women. So we're seeing things like age driving influence, intelligence driving influence, and respectfulness driving influence, but not generosity, not hardworkingness. Those are sort of separate. Those are separate issues in the causal model, right? So this is somewhat different than the data I showed you before. That's for women. Here's men. It's very similar, although the BayesNets drew the boxes differently, so they look different. They're pretty similar, actually. Influence is being driven by age, by attractiveness and respectfulness. Intelligence is driving respectfulness and hardworkingness, which then goes on to drive these other things. So this is what the machine learning approach thinks is the kind of causal diagram for this data. I'll note that this is really complicated by wealth data. So I've done this with wealth as well. It really limits our sample size, which is a problem for Bayes nets. But when you put wealth in here in min, basically you get wealth box that kind of sits right there. So age drives wealth, which drives influence. So that's what that looks like. So I threw them all together to see what it looks like. And this is what we get. So we're seeing, I've included sex here as well. Sex is not a meaningful driver of any of these relationships, it turns out, which kind of speaks back to our finding that we don't see any sex differences in status. But we're seeing things like respectfulness driving some of these other traits which are leading to influential separately. So I'm not quite sure how to use this approach yet. This is brand new stuff. And again, the computer is very stupid when it's doing this. You have to tell it that influence can't drive age, for example. It might put age at the bottom. It might say that like, oh, if you're more hardworking, you're also older, right? Instead of the other way around. So you have to be careful and you sort of tell it what to do in some cases. Here I'm telling it that age and sex cannot be predicted by other variables. They're sort of basal to this relationship. But I think this could be a useful way to sort of tease out relationships where we don't have strong priors about some of the direction of these arrows, and we don't really have a strong causal model going in. This isn't like very like McLaurithian of me to use this approach, but I think it's an interesting tool. I think you can use this tool alongside others as well. Okay, so going back to sort of the big picture here, peer evaluation, collection of peer evaluation data is one tool in the toolbox, and I think it's best to combine these peer evaluation data with other types of data. You can layer on things like demography, health measures here. We're also looking at things like economic games. We're using ranking tasks and stuff. This is somebody doing wealth ranking task. So I think it's one tool in the toolbox. It's not necessarily a silver bullet, but it is a useful way to collect a specific type of data and to do so pretty easily if you sort of automate it beforehand. So kind of concluding thoughts here. We need to think about the costs and benefits of doing this approach. So it requires a lot of upfront work, but it has a lot of major benefits. It can be really useful for specific types of questions here, and best in conjunction with other approaches. But you also have to carefully consider the types of evaluations, right? What traits are you going to use beforehand? Are these traits locally relevant? Are these traits different enough that they're worth collecting data on? And I think in the future we're probably going to pare down some of the traits we collect data on based on our findings here. So it's a useful approach, but not a silver bullet. And then to be aware of the back end, there is a lot of data problems on the other side of this. A lot of analysis decisions that you're going to have to make. In particular, I think issues about multicollinearity and others. So just be aware of that as well. Okay, so that is all I have got. So I just want to thank the following folks, Brooke and Jacob Chihama, project co-directors, and all you guys for helping me develop all these approaches. I did all this stuff when I was here, so I appreciate all your feedback and support over the years. So that's it. Thank you.
Start with questions maybe in the room.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Really, really interesting. And man, those graphs are super pretty.
Yeah. I had to kind of stare at them for a while and think about them. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I might have to go back and look at some of them. This is a lot of information, but really, really nice. So I guess I just had two questions. One I think is like a question about the study, and one is maybe just about the HIMBA more broadly. So you said sort of in passing that the sex ratio in the group was heavily skewed female.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that is, where have the men gone?
Yeah.
And then I was also wondering with your status rating, so for that they're just saying high or low, right? They're looking at a photo.
Yep, it's a binary outcome. Yeah.
And you didn't find that there were differences in sex for that. Which I thought was really interesting, but it made me wonder whether, when people are judging high or low status, how do you know what the comparison group is? So if people are, see a photo of a woman and they're judging high status, how do you know that they're not comparing her to other women as opposed to other men?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, whether that's a limitation of this as opposed to using something that, is more ranked individuals of the same gender or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, what is the drawback to using this binary outcome approach to look at sex difference? And I think you're exactly right. And your explanation is exactly what we wrote in our paper, which is under review right now, that it is a limitation of the data, the way we collected the data. It is possible that when men and women are rating men and women on status, they are doing so in a relative way, so like influential for a man or influential for a woman. So that's something we really can't correct for, post hoc. So I suspect that even though we don't find any status difference here, there are differences in political leadership. All the chiefs are male, all the sub-chiefs are male. When we ask people to sort of free list influential, there's like a kind of influential council of elders. We ask people to sort of like who's in the council of elders, ask them to free list those people. Most of the time it's men. It's like 80% men. So based on that, I suspect that even though we found no sex difference in status in this task, I think you're probably right that there is probably something going on, that there probably is some fundamental sex difference in at least political leadership in some way. But that is a drawback of that approach, yeah. So I think, if we could go back and have two photos come up and a man and a woman, or a man and man and woman and woman, and have them do it again and say which one's more influential and pick one, that might be a way to resolve this. But yeah. But your other question about why is the ASR so skewed, it's a question. We don't know. It is like one of the more skewed ASRs out there in some of the small scale societies. We have a paper on the jealousy paper where we looked at ASR as a predictor, and Himba were on the very far end. They're on the far left side of the distributions. They were the most extreme example of this.
What does ACE stand for?
Adult sex ratio.
Okay.
Yeah. So we think it may be due to higher child mortality in boys. Girls are probably treated a little better. They're more useful in the household. And so in places where we see this, this is true actually in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, girls tend to have higher like anthropometric outcomes as associated with kind of preferential treatment. So we think it's probably that, but we can't really, it's really hard to collect data on infant deaths because women don't like to talk about it at all. It's like one of the things we can't collect data on. So to get that data, you have to sort of go kind of on the back end, like talk to her mother or talk to her sister and say, oh, did she lose any kids? And get that information. But it's really hard to collect that data. But short answer is we're not really sure. Yep.
I have a question, just following up on the anthropometry one, and thank you, Erica, because I was curious about the sex ratio. Was my other question, but already answered. Why does, or not why, but how do you think status translates into better anthropometrics?
Yeah.
What's happening?
Yeah, it's a good question. We think it's probably something about within household dynamics about who has a say over where the money goes, for example. There's a really good study in Brazil where they were looking at who in a married household, if a woman has control of the money or a man has control of the money, and they found that like when women have control of the money, there's a 20-fold increase in child survival when women control the funds versus when men do. So I suspect it's something about how resources are distributed. Whereas maybe if men are wielding more status in the dynamic, they might be using it to get more cows or to pursue other reproductive opportunities or something.
As opposed to like foodstuffs for the household.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And you see it. Do you see it pre-weaning because it would affect maternal nutrition?
Yeah.
Or not necessarily pre-weaning, but pre-introduction of other foods?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if we've looked at the anthropometrics that closely.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. I mean, I showed sort of interaction effect. Mm-hmm. The younger they get, the harder they are to measure. So
Yeah.
we often don't have like a really high caliber baby scale in the field. So infants are we don't really measure. So it's tough to say. Yeah. Yeah, Renee.
Hi, thanks so much for this talk. I thought it was really cool to see all of this kind of combined. I had a question about something you kind of mentioned towards the end about the relationship between having higher mate value, or I think maybe higher desirability score, and having more partners. So, I mean, I guess you could imagine that like if you're a more desirable person, it's easier to get more partners. I could also imagine that there's some like that the causal error also goes in the other direction, but then in a negative way, maybe like if this person already has many partners, then maybe they are less desirable for you because like they're already like busy with other things. And, like they're already diverting their resources to like somebody else's kids or something like that.
Right.
So I was wondering if I don't know if the data allows you to do this, but I was wondering if you looked at like kind of the bi-directionality of the causal error, and maybe if there's like a sex difference there as well, in how the number of current partners affects your desirability for new partners.
Right. So the question is number of partners and desirability. I think you're right that there's a sex difference. So for men, I mean, I guess we do have data on this. We could look at it, but like anecdotally, men with lots of partners tend to be really highly desirable, and sort of goes in both directions. I think like there's one guy in the community that's got like 20 girlfriends, and I was kind of skeptical about this, but turns out that like asking year after year, he says the same number, and then women say he's very desirable. So I think in that case, there's sort of a positive relationship. Women, there might be sort of a plateau effect. So we know that like women who have boyfriends are seen as more desirable, and that's a good thing. Even husbands say, I don't want a wife who's undesirable and doesn't have any boyfriends. So, but at the same time, there's also people talk about women who have too many boyfriends. They'll say like negative things about her. So it's like there's sort of a sweet spot for women that like 1 or 2 boyfriends is okay and actually desirable, but more than that, it's kind of like, okay, what are you doing with your time, right? So I think that I think that's sort of I think you're right about the sex difference. Yeah.
Okay. If I can quickly ask follow-up, do you know if for men is there a difference between like having many girlfriends versus having many wives?
I think they're probably correlated, I would guess. You mean like having more wives than you? I would think that they are probably the same, but I'm not sure if I've thought about it too much. Yeah.
I guess it's a desirability question. I forgot how you guys asked it, but like.
It's do you want to be in a relationship with this person? So we weren't saying if it's a marital or non-marital relationship. We wanted to keep that open. Otherwise, we have to do it twice. So we kept it open for specifically to see that exact question. But yeah, I guess we can't really differentiate if like, oh, you want to be in an informal relationship or a marital relationship. We can't exactly tell. Yeah.
I have a question about the machine learning bit.
Okay. Direct all questions to Rob Walker at University of Missouri. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, yeah, so I have to admit I'm not like I don't know much about machine learning, but it was just I'm wondering how much confidence can you have in that sort of technique? Sort of just letting the machine come up with the optimal relationship.
Yeah.
Like correlation is not causation, but also like
Right.
machine learning is not doing something extra special.
Right.
Like we couldn't get with correlation, and then also you said it was Bayesian, so I'm assuming that means you like set some priors.
Yeah.
Just beforehand.
I think they're using sort of default priors right now. I don't exactly understand the mechanics of this package yet. I'm letting Rob Walker sort of lead the way on this right now. But you're right that it is sort of like, it's not magic. It is kind of dumb in a way. Like the first couple times I ran this, it was saying that like more generous people are older, right? Like generosity is driving age, for example, which of course isn't the case, right? So you have to tell it like, sex and age are basal to all these other relationships. There's a lot of decisions that go into sort of fine tuning it. I'm giving you actually pretty conservative DAGs. So when I first started, I was saying like the threshold for the direction of causality is low, and then it was giving me all sorts of wild, arrows going everywhere. I'm like, I don't know how to interpret this. This is useless. So how much do I trust it? I'm still skeptical at this point. I'm open to it being a useful tool, but I don't think it's going to be, the way of the future, I suspect. I think for certain things like, where we have these traits and we don't exactly know how they relate, we don't have any strong priors, I think it could be useful to sort of see which direction things are going. I should have said that the size of the arrow is kind of the strength of the relationship. What you can't see from this is how sure it is which direction the arrow is going. I've trimmed it so that like you can only see relationships where it's more than like 75% sure it's in one direction. But if you lower that threshold, again, it's showing you relationships where it actually doesn't know which way the arrow is going. It's just saying that they're tied in some way where it's guessing this direction. So, but there's a lot that goes into it that I don't quite understand yet. So I'm skeptical, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks. This was super interesting. I guess I have two questions, like on the methods portion. So I guess like here I'm thinking, well, you were saying that the traits were locally derived, and so I'm just a little curious, like if somebody says generous or describes somebody as hardworking, like what do they mean by that, and do everybody like describe it in the same way? And then the second question is, I know that you're talking about perceptions and that you're looking at these peer evaluations, and so I'm just a little, and how that might be more informative. But I'm also a little curious if you've looked at peer evaluations as well as self-reported evaluations, and whether or not those like correlate in some way, or if they might be, or if there's some inconsistencies in the way it's being reported, because that might also be telling in ways that how it might be affecting like these reproductive or rating strategies and things like that.
Yeah. So how do peer evaluations related to these? Personal evaluations relate to peer evaluations. We've struggled to get good personal evaluations. We used the MacArthur ladder a couple of times, which is basically like ranking yourself on a 10-point Likert scale of status, and it's delivered in such a way that it should be like easy to answer. And we have the hardest time getting people to answer that. Like it is a struggle to get people to answer that. We could spend 15 minutes describing the scale, talking about where people fall, and then asking them where they plant themselves, and it is such a struggle. And I've heard this from other people as well, that they really struggle through this because it's sort of impolite to say, oh, I'm really high status or I'm really low status. People often say like, oh, I'm at the very bottom. I couldn't possibly be high status, But the sort of social norm is you're not really allowed to report it. You're supposed to be sort of, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? You're supposed to sort of be restrained. Yeah, humble, yeah. And the first question was about the choice of traits. So those were community-driven traits. It was actually Brooke did this. She used focus groups and then asked people, what's important in a partner, and they say, here are things that are important. They discussed them out loud. They were using Ochi Herero. They're not using English, and so Ondengaro or Omohona. These are like locally derived terms for these traits that are now translated in English. So I think I'm pretty confident that people have a general sense of like what the Ochihero word for generous means for Ochihero speaking people. I think I'm more worried about how much some of these different things that we think are separate might line up, like respectful and generous, like these are both good qualities, and how much do those sort of like clump together. And this kind of suggests maybe they do clump together. So yeah. Yeah, Brian.
I have a couple questions, and you can choose whichever one you want to answer.
Okay.
We could talk about the rest at dinner.
Okay.
Or whenever. So one question I have is kind of building on the issue of sex differences in status as reflected in the ratings. And there's the issue that you already mentioned about not being sure how to translate between the two genders. Perhaps there's an internalized relative ranking there. If I was wondering if you've looked at, because with this question of status differentials observed in the real world, like you mentioned, there is 80% of the council of elders were males. So I kind of have two questions about that. One is, if you look at the question of being influential slightly differently and say, what's the probability of being ranked in the top 1% of the populations, a local hierarchy?
Yeah.
Do you see a sex difference there? And I know that could be harder to estimate, but
yeah, I think you're right. I think you're exactly right that there would be a major sex difference there, and that the chief is always going to be male. The chief just died a couple years ago, and now his son is chief.
Yeah.
All the chief across the road is a male. The big head chief is male.
Yeah. The ratings, though, and the ratings that people are giving. So there's two questions. One is, do the ratings that people provide correlate with what's observed in the real world? That's
okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But then also, if you aggregate all of the rankings of everyone in your sample, and then you sort it by total binary count of being influential.
Oh, I see.
And then you look at the top 10 in the entire community, what's the sex ratio there?
Right. Right.
So you could have, for example, by gender, the same likelihood of being said yes is influential, but then the variability is what's going to drive
right.
higher end of the differential.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Sorry, Dan's reminded me to repeat the question, but the question is like, if we were just looking at status differentials in the very top 10% or 1%, what would we see? And I think you're exactly right that it's probably, and we can look at that actually in the data. We should do that. We could look at something like a Gini coefficient or something too and see what that looks like as well. But I think you're exactly right that it's going to be male bias. And all the evidence suggests that this is a place where women have a lot of status, but I think that the political leadership piece of it is that men are generally in charge. It's men that inherit the wealth from, it's matrilineal, but men are inheriting wealth from mother, brother to sister, son. So.
Yeah, I mean that's super interesting because, I mean, for a lot of reasons, but it would suggest like day to day people could have a somewhat egalitarian understanding of status, but it's only when you're doing this highly selective top 1 percentile sort of high stakes situation with who's going to be on the council that you'll see those strong sex differences. It might not be reflective of the day to day.
Yeah.
I'm just getting, that's really intriguing.
Yeah.
And then do you so in my study population, there is a phenomenon. I'm just wondering if this is also rings true in your situation. Maybe it's something you could look at. Would be that individuals who have a lot of credibility and status and trustworthiness and hardworking and highly respected will intentionally avoid the positions of official political power. For example, the decision to sitting on the council, right? Do you see that? Do you see evidence in your data for people who have a lot of clout and who are considered highly influential, but who opt out of the official sort of status markers in this? So I see that as a very frequent thing.
Yeah, it's a good question.
The political office usually is more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, so the question is, Dan, that do like real high status people opt out of kind of formal political leadership? There's not a lot of formal decisions that have to be made in this community. It's typically like dispute-related things, like somebody stole a cow or whatever. Somebody got caught with a girlfriend and has to get a fine, and they go to the chief, right? So there's not a lot of day-to-day work. It seems like it's not something that we've spent a lot of time looking at, but I'd be sort of surprised. I mean, the informal council of elders is very informal. It's like, we need to get together and decide something. I'm going to call my brother and I'm going to call the uncle and this guy, and they're in walking distance, and they'll people will listen to them. So it's not, they're not being elected to Senate or anything like that. Yeah. So I suspect that the workload is such that it's not really. That's not going to prohibit somebody from, seeking high office, quote unquote. And the chief is, it's inherited, right? So, yeah. I don't know, Brooke, do you agree?
I'm just thinking like one of the actual formal positions, they have these conservancies, and the person who's in charge of the conservancy for the area is somebody that we rarely see in the community. He does get listed on these influential lists, but
he might actually have actual work.
Yeah, he has actual work and actual power, but he's not as present. I don't know. And the one super wealthy guy who I think we all want who spends most of his time out of the community, and I wonder if that's also like he's got lots of cows, right? Like the more time he's there, the more time people may be asking him to borrow. Like they do a lot of cattle lending and stuff like that. So I don't know whether he might purposefully distance himself, but I'm not sure it's out of being humble as much as it's like trying to maybe not get asked for too much or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh, Dan and Dan has a question.
Oh, okay.
Too, but you can.
Okay. Yeah. So like obviously when people are ranking members of the community like within the community, that could cause like I don't know trauma or potential like conflicts of like he said she said. So like how do you balance like transparency in your study with the community, but also like keeping that information private?
Yeah, that's one issue with data collection like this is that these people, right? I mean, it's a benefit because I asked somebody, is this person generous? And they have, decades worth of knowledge, but that means they also might be biased by like, are they kin? Did they get in an argument with that person last week? So that is a bit of a problem. In terms of keeping it private, I mean, we don't share any of it. So I haven't heard a lot of concern about that. I'm not particularly, people like doing the task and they know what the task is about. And, we ask them when we take their photo, can we use your photo to do this task? And so almost everybody is happy to do it, and they don't seem to have a problem with it. So I don't get the sense that like there's a lot of kind of sniping in the back or something about it. Yeah. Yep.
I was just wondering how stable people's ratings are over time, whether you've measured the same people's perceptions in the same photos.
I was just talking to Brian about this. This data collection was sort of like, let's try that this summer, and it was it's basically cross-sectional. It's over 2 or 3 years, but we want to follow up with this post-COVID when like half the senior men are dead. The social dynamics have totally changed. It's a very different social world now, so we're going to rerun some of these traits at least in the future to see how it does change over time. That means I have to rewrite the back end of the database so that it goes from cross-sectional to longitudinal. But yeah, we're going to look. That's in the future.
I guess my question was less about how it will change over time, and more about trying to figure out like, did someone have an argument last week? Like, do people are people stable in how they rate? How generous they think Fred is. Right.
Yeah. I don't know if we can evaluate that specifically. I'm not really worried about, having some one internal dynamic during the. I mean, we have 10,000 of these ratings. Like, it's a ton of data, and it's modeled such that like people who are like raters who are really negative in their ratings, those get discounted. So you have rater and ratee effects going on. So you can sort of correct for that in a way. Yeah. I think that's fine.
Can you hear me, Sean?
Yep.
Hi, Sean. So, forgive me if you presented this and I missed it, because there was so much material, but kind of a standard finding in the social psychology, that isn't biological market theory driven, but is compatible with biological market theory, is that when there's a disparity in the value between the two parties, then the lower value individual compromises more often. That is, they accede to the wishes of the higher value partner. And if, for example, when it comes to women, there's kind of an optimal number of boyfriends, and from her desirability perspective, so none suggests she's undesirable, a few suggest she's very desirable, and too many suggest she's spending her time on other things. Then in those relationships where you see a disparity, that's an area where you would see compromise, right? And it seems to me that your data afford answering that question.
So, sorry, just to repeat the question, it's.
I can't
Oh,
hear you.
sorry.
You have to unmute.
I have to unmute myself on this?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, okay. So just to repeat the question, it's when there's a disparity in the mate value of the relationship, the lower mate value party does what exactly?
I mean, what we see in, for example, data from dating pairs in American college students is that they just compromise more often. That is, they meet the wishes of the higher value party, right? So, you want to go to the movie, I want to, go to the mall. Well, you're higher than me, so we go to the movie. That is, we do what you want to do, right? And so in the HIMA context, if, as you described it, there's kind of an optimal number of boyfriends that a woman has. If she has none, then it suggests she's undesirable. If she has too many, then she's undesirable because she's spending her time on things that meet her goals and not necessarily those of her partner. Well, in a relationship where the woman is of higher value than the man, she should exceed the optimal number of boyfriends. And in a relationship where the converse applies, the opposite should be true.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think I mean, we tried to look at the relationship dynamics that your question is speaking to with some of those kind of relationship traits about, there was a question about does your partner have lots of extra boyfriends and girlfriends? And it did suggest that when your partner's mate value is higher, you think they have more boyfriends and girlfriends. So I think that does kind of speak to your question. We have data on actual numbers of boyfriends and girlfriends that we could probably match and see if we're finding exactly what you suggest, but we have not done that yet. But that is a possibility. We are looking at other things about mate value. So we're looking at paternity. We've got an upcoming analysis where we're going to see in cases where mate value is really discordant, do we see higher non-paternity rates, for example? And that might be another way that the partnership dynamics related to mate value are sort of manifesting.
That might be another pathway to answer the same question.
Sorry, we missed that last note.
I said, if you have resource allocation decisions, then that's another variable that you could use to answer the same question. So, if the man is substantially higher in value than his partner, then, he spends more of the available resources that he controls on cattle or buying gifts for girlfriends or something like that. And if the inverse relationship obtains, then the opposite is true.
Yeah, I think that's a fair prediction. That's not something we've looked at, but we could theoretically look at in the future. Yeah, that's a good idea. All right. Any other questions? Okay.
Great.
All right, thank you.